Want to transform your little one or yourself into a roaring dinosaur in an afternoon? Let's sew up a dino tail together. Hi, I'm Christina, and I am a digital pattern maker and sewing educator who loves turning creativity into wearable art fun. Today, we're going to be sewing a dinosaur tail step by step, and if you'd like to make your own, the full sewing pattern and packet is available in my shop. I will go ahead and link it down below so that you can grab it and follow along. Let's get sewing. I'm going to start by projecting my pattern out using projectorsewing.com. It is a super helpful website for when you are wanting to project a pattern. I'm starting with cutting the waistband. Now, I am not going to cut the waistband to size of the pattern I currently have because I'm going to be making this dino tail for myself and I need a little bit wider of a waistband. This is something I also recommend if you want a dino tail that can grow with your little one or for yourself. Sometimes cutting an extra long waistband is the way to go, so it can easily change sizes. So you can have multiple lengths of Velcro for anybody to use to be easily able to change the size. I am also cutting this waistband on the cross grain to help conserve some fabric, and since I will be adding some stabilizer to it, I'm not too worried about that. Next, we're going to move on to the small triangle that we'll be sewing onto the waistband that will hold the dino tail onto the waistband. This is just a simple triangle that I'm putting real close to the edge of my fabric. Then the last one that I need to cut out of this color fabric is the actual dinosaur tail. It's this big long triangle piece that we will fold up to eventually make it look like the dino tail. Before I cut it though, I want to ensure that I am marking where all the spikes go and any of the other guideline marks that I need. Using my rotary cutter, I'm going to then cut out the large dino tail. Once that is done, it's time to move on to my spike fabric. I chose to do my spike fabric out of a dark green to contrast my red and black cracked skin of the dinosaur tail. I'm going to be cutting all of these on the fold since I'll be cutting out 2 of each. And then I'm just going to line up and use my rotary cutter on the bottom and then rotary cutter on the top, and then go through and cut out each one individually. I did find that as I was cutting so close, I did struggle with the fabric wanting to move on me, so I got a ruler to help hold the fabric and keep me going in a straight line. And there we have it. All of them are cut out. I'm going to place them in a pile with my other fabric and move on to the last thing I need to cut out, which is the interfacing. I'm going to be interfacing one of my waistbands and the triangle that's going to connect the tail to that waistband. Both of those need a little bit extra stability, and having some interfacing there will make that difference. I'm going to start by lining up my waistband and cutting around the waistband. And then I'm going to do the same for the triangle piece. Now it's time to move on to the sewing, the best part, watching it come together. I'm going to start by making all of the spikes. I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around on this pattern. I'm going to sew up one side to the point. I'm going to turn my fabric 90 degrees, do a single stitch, then turn it back again to line it up to go down the other side. I do this because it's going to really help with that point turn if you have just a tiny bit of space for your fabric to ease into it. I always recommend when you are having patterns with points, whether they are the points like this or the concave points that some of the other patterns I have on them, I always recommend having a single stitch at every point. And then, of course, I backstitch at the end. Once they are all made, it is time to turn them right side out. Before you turn them right side out, you want to trim away some of that excess fabric up in the point specifically. So I always like to trim as close as I can without actually clipping through the thread. That's the essential part. Don't clip through that thread. Then I will flip it right side out, then use a point turner to get that point nice and crisp. Once they are all flipped to the right side, I'm going to go ahead and move over to my ironing board and iron these points. Now, because I'm stuffing that, this isn't necessarily a requirement. However, I always find adding a little bit of ironing and pressing to any of your project will always make the end result look better. While I'm here at the ironing board, I'm going to go ahead and iron on the stabilizers to the triangle piece and to the waistband. The process for ironing on the stabilizer is slow. It's a whole bunch of waiting to make sure it is nice and fused down. It's back to the sewing machine, but before we're sewing anything, we need to stuff our spikes. This is one of those that it's going to depend on how stiff you want your spikes. I always like to stuff them a little bit more firm, which will cause me a little bit more problems when I'm sewing, but will make the end result last longer. To stuff all the way up into the points, I find that using a tool or specifically a pencil with an eraser can really help get that batting up into that point where you want it so that the point isn't like flappy flimsy when the rest of it is strong and sturdy. Once you are happy with how much stuffing you have stuffed into each of the spikes, it is time to pin it onto the tail using the guidelines that you marked when you were cutting out the fabric. You don't have to stuff and then pin and then stuff and then pin. You can stuff them all and then pin them all as well. I just chose to stuff and pin because I thought it would be easier to help keep all that batting contained. Once you have them all pinned on, I always recommend base stitching all of the spikes on so that they don't move when you're actually trying to create the full dino tail. You can either use a zipper foot because you are dealing with a lot of batting that will help it get a little bit closer. I did not. I chose to stay with my regular foot because I pushed most of my batting out of the way and I wanted the stability of the regular foot. Once it's basted on, it's time to sew up your dino tail. You're going to match up your two edges, folding right side to right side and ensuring that all the spikes are out of your way. I am going to tell you, I chose to do 7 spikes on this tail and I struggled for the last 2 spikes. I kind of had to manipulate them a little bit. I had to work with them and kind of make sure they were pushed out of the way whilst keeping the fabric regular. So the last 2 spikes were very hard to get in with this long, skinny tail. I would recommend maybe doing a few less spikes so that you don't have nearly as much trouble as I did, or maybe those last few spikes make them a little bit smaller. That is also an option. And then finally, when you get down to the very end, you're going to want to not just sew off into a point, but do something similar to what we did with the spikes, where you turn 90 degrees and sew off so that it's not a point, but a nice little squared end. It will turn into a beautiful point, I promise. Then it's time to flip the dino tail right side out. It's actually really handy to have the spikes. It helps flip it right side out, especially when you get towards that really tiny area. And the spikes makes it easy to grab onto something to get it to flip right side out. Once you get all the way down to that very teeny tiny point, I used a pin to pull it out a little bit, and then eventually I moved to a pencil where I gently worked it all the way out. Because of how thin it was, I couldn't use my point turner, and because I was using a pencil, I did want to take extra care that I didn't accidentally poke all the way through. Now it's time to stuff the tail. I recommend gathering up the tail as best you can to stuff the very smallest part of the tail first. That way you have the most access to that tiny part of the tail. I also recommend using a pencil with an eraser to really get that point stuffed out. This is going to be one of the harder parts of it just because of how skinny this tail gets, but I promise you in the long run, it's going to be worth it. Then, once you are happy with that stuffing, I release the gathering of the tail a little bit and continue to stuff. As I work through, I continually kind of push down on my tail to make sure the stuffing is even and about at the weight I'm looking for. Now you only want to stuff your tail about to 90%. That way you will be able to do the final sewing by machine. We're going to take that triangle piece that we will be eventually attaching to our waistband, and we're going to line it up with the very tippy top point of the tail, which is also that seam. Then you're going to stitch down one side, and this time you are not going to go from edge to edge. You're going to be following basically what would be considered like the stitch line. So you're going to come in about 1/2 inch from the top, and you want to end about 1/2 inch from the bottom. And you're going to go down one side of the triangle, and then you're going to come back up to the top and go down the other side of the triangle. So you are only going to be machine sewing the two sides of the triangle. Then we're going to finish stuffing as much as we can. Then we're going to flip in our leftover seam allowances from the bottom of the triangle and the bottom of the tail, and we're going to stitch it shut. Now you do have a few different options of stitches you can choose from. I am doing a slip stitch. I'm going in one side, traveling through the little tunnel of the fold that is created, coming out, and then doing the exact same on the other side, going in, traveling through that little tunnel, and coming back out. This makes it a much more hidden stitch. Another stitch that you could easily do is a whip stitch. Nobody is really going to be seeing this. This is going to be at the very bottom, and with my fabric, a whip stitch also would have blended in just fine. Now it's time to make the waistband. I'm going to line up the two edges and sew 1/2 inch away from the edge using the guide on my sewing machine. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and then sew all the way down and backstitch at the end. Now remember, my waistband is a bit longer than the one that I provided in the pattern, and that is because I'm making it for myself and not for a little kid, so I needed a little bit bigger of a waistband. Once I do the one side, I'm going to flip around and do the other. Then it's time to flip it right side out. But before I flip it right side out, I want to press open the seams. This will make it easier for when I'm ironing the waistband right side out. Once I have them all ironed, it's time to flip it. I don't have any cool tube turners, so I'm using a safety pin. I feed my safety pin in and out at one end. I always like to use the stabilizer side because it's a bit more sturdy. Then I'm going to feed my safety pin into the opening and start feeding it through. As I'm feeding it through, I'm working the fabric to continue moving through while pulling the other fabric on top of it. Eventually, I will work my safety pin out and I can finish pulling through the entire waistband. Once it is entirely flipped back out, I will remove the safety pin and re-iron the waistband flat. This will take a little bit of finagling and a little bit of jiggling, but it will really help make sure that your waistband doesn't look weird or puffy, especially since we just scrunched it all up to flip it right side out. Now it's time to actually attach the tail to the waistband. I found the middle of the waistband and I'm going to line it up with the very top of my tail. And I'm going to give it a good pin in so it doesn't move on me or anything. Next, I'm going to flip the waistband down, lining it up with the edge of the triangle, and I am going to stitch the waistband to the tail. For this stitch, I decided to use a whip stitch because I wanted it to be very strong and very sturdy. if I stitched through both layers of the waistband, it would still provide a flat enough stitch that it wouldn't cause any problems. Therefore, I whip stitched up one side of the tail and then down the other side. And I did this twice. I wanted to make sure that it was a very secure connection. And now it is time to tie off on one of the corners. Next, it is time to sew on the closures. I have an extra long waistband here, so I am going to show you an example. If you had a small growing child that you wanted to be able to readjust the final measurement of the waistband, you can do a large fold back like you see here and sew the entire flap down and then only have the Velcro on the very edge. This will make it so that your dinosaur tail will grow with your little one to as big as you have the waistband for. Now it's time for the Velcro closures. I always recommend finishing off the edges, whether that's turning the raw edge back and having it underneath the Velcro. Then you can top stitch all the way around the edges of the Velcro to secure it down. Or if you flip everything to the inside of the waistband and then sewing the Velcro on top of that. Either one of these works great. I do recommend having the hard Velcro facing out and the soft Velcro facing in. That way, if the Velcro is ever not aligned or anything, it is the soft Velcro that is touching your skin or touching your clothing and not the harsh Velcro that's a little bit more scratchy and irritating. That means your dinosaur waistband is done and attached, and now you can try it on. Ooh, look at how cute it looks. And that's it. Your dinosaur tail is ready to roar. If you enjoyed sewing along, don't forget to grab the pattern in my shop so you can make more tails of different sizes for all the little dinos in your life. Make sure to subscribe to see more digital pattern drafting as well as more sew along fun videos. Until next time, happy sewing!